From June 1940 to May 1945, the Third Reich and the Western Allies fought the longest battle of the Second World War. For both sides, control of the Atlantic Ocean was the key to final victory or defeat. For Germany, the Battle of the Atlantic was meant to lead to the complete surrender of Great Britain. With numerous U-boats, fast, long-range battleships, and the might of the Luftwaffe, the Third Reich intended to sever Britain's vital transatlantic arteries, starving her war industries and demoralizing her people. In fact, Hitler had made a fatal miscalculation. Germany went to war long before its navy was prepared. The failure to halt the steady traffic of essential supplies flowing across the Atlantic would allow the Allies time to build, in Britain, a gigantic arsenal of men and weapons. In the end, Great Britain would become the springboard from which the vast resources of the United States would be unleashed on Hitler's Reich. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's armies stormed into Poland. As the triumphant Wehrmacht ripped through the ill-equipped ranks of Polish conscripts, the world was already uniting in bitter protest. Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand and Canada all declared war within a week. But none shared a border with Poland, ruling out any possibility of immediate reprisals. The Nazi offensive had involved almost all Germany's armed forces, including much of its reserves, leaving the Reich's border with France dangerously vulnerable. But France made little effort to relieve its Polish ally. While the war in Europe stagnated, the German submarines, aimed at Britain's vital trade, had already inflicted heavy casualties. Together with Germany's powerful surface fleet, the U-boats ensured that for many months, the sea would be the main arena of conflict. In the weeks before the outbreak of war, the German Navy had dispatched its revolutionary pocket battleships, Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee, deep into the Atlantic Ocean. Here they would prey on British merchant vessels, sailing along the traditional shipping lanes. Closer to Great Britain, 39 U-boats had taken up positions around the coastline and across the western approaches, where the Atlantic shipping lanes converged. On September the 3rd, the very first day of the war, the U-30 sighted the British passenger liner Athenia, and disobeying orders, it torpedoed the ship without warning, killing 128. It was a disaster for German propaganda, but 2 weeks later, U-29 sank the British aircraft carrier Courageous. This spectacular triumph was soon followed up by the greatest U-boat coup of all, as U-47 sailed into Scapa Flow, base of the British Home Fleet, and sank the battleship Royal Oak. By the end of 1939, in just 4 months of warfare, German submarines had sunk 114 Allied merchant ships. Although the U-boat offensive against British trade had got off to a highly successful start, The German surface fleet had not shared the submariner's success. Early in her voyage, Admiral Graf Spee had sunk 50,000 tons of Allied merchant shipping, forcing the Allies to organize a massive hunt. She was pursued by 7 naval squadrons, relentlessly searching throughout the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Finally, in December 1939, 3 cruisers of Force G correctly guessed the Graf Spee's position and caught up with the battleship off the coast of Uruguay. It was the German, with more powerful radar-assisted 11-inch guns, who fired first, and with deadly accuracy. She soon reduced the largest cruiser to a defenseless burning hulk, but her own damage finally became too great. She turned and fled to the nearest haven, the neutral Uruguayan port of Montevideo. In port, the crew nursed their wounded, while the German authorities frantically negotiated with Uruguayan officials for extra time to carry out repairs. The Uruguayans refused, and just as the allotted 72 hours ran out, the German Captain Langsdorff heard news of the arrival of powerful British reinforcements. It was a deception, but demoralized, Langsdorff assembled a skeleton crew and weighed anchor. Out in open water, they laid explosive charges and scuttled the Admiral Graf Spee. The defeat, a damaging blow to Kriegsmarine prestige, was the first Allied victory of the war and gave a great boost to British morale. In the spring of 1940, the German war on Allied trade was temporarily abandoned, as most of the U-boat fleet was withdrawn to its bases in the Baltic to re-equip in preparation for Hitler's coming offensive against Norway. German intelligence had learned of a British plan to seize the Norwegian port of Narvik and cut off vital German iron ore supplies. To prevent the British attack, Hitler ordered the occupation of Norway and Denmark. The daring plan, calling for close inter-service cooperation, would utilize almost the entire German Navy. Several days before the Norwegian invasion began, the Germans had laid submarine screens to trap the British fleet north of the Shetland Islands and outside Scapa Flow. On April the 9th, the Wehrmacht marched into Denmark, while troops from 6 naval groups began landing at Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Egersund, Kristiansand, and Oslo. Denmark fell quickly, and to the north, the first 5 assault groups met with almost no resistance, rapidly achieving their objectives. Only at Oslo was a fierce defense put up. The heavy cruiser Blücher was sunk by shore batteries before the city finally fell to Luftwaffe paratroops. The Royal Navy, having escaped the German submarine screens, also took its toll. At Kristiansand, a British submarine torpedoed the light cruiser Karlsruhe. Further south, another British submarine severely damaged the pocket battleship Lutzow, while the cruiser Königsberg was sunk by bombers from Orkney. In just a few days of savage naval battles around Norway's shores, the German Navy lost, in addition to the 4 cruisers, 9 destroyers and 4 U-boats. Although the Kriegsmarine had been severely mauled in the battle for Norway, the U-boats had used the opportunity to practice new tactics of U-boat cooperation. Just as important, the invasion battles uncovered several major weaknesses in U-boat torpedoes. Magnetic detonators had regularly misfired, and a high proportion of torpedoes had failed to run at the correct depth. Further use of the magnetic heads was banned. After Norway, the U-boats would be better prepared than ever before to wreak havoc with Britain's shipping. For the first few months of the war, Adolf Hitler would not countenance unrestricted naval warfare against the United Kingdom. This was in spite of the knowledge that Great Britain was utterly dependent on trade with the Commonwealth, and that the United States was promising to send American aid to the Allies. Hitler was fearful that if Great Britain was destroyed and her empire irrevocably shattered, then faraway powers like Japan and the United States would be in a much better position to pick up the remnants for themselves. Hitler was also keen to retain the spoils of Poland and Norway without resorting to another expensive war. So he remained optimistic about coming to a peace agreement with Britain's leaders. Hitler had always understood that Germany was historically a continental empire, limited by the size of its navy and the vulnerability of its ports. Since Hitler had taken power, his naval policy had been directed towards the creation of a powerful surface fleet that could rival the British. He craved the imperial grandeur of the traditional fleet, with its battleships and cruisers. However, the performance of Germany's navy in the war so far had disillusioned the Führer. The defeat of the Admiral Graf Spee was especially humiliating, and the naval catastrophe in Norway had marred what was an otherwise successful invasion. Only the spectacular triumphs of the U-boat arm maintained his confidence in the Kriegsmarine. Hitler's enthusiastic support continued to grow, ensuring that the U-boat building program would soon be given the highest priority. As a soldier, Hitler understood little of naval issues. He continually interfered with the army, to the general's unending frustration. But he held the naval hierarchy in high esteem and allowed them an unusually free hand in operational decisions. On the outbreak of war, Winston Churchill had returned to the British Admiralty as First Lord, the very same post he had held in the Great War 25 years earlier. The news of his return was heartily welcomed by the Royal Navy he adored. Churchill was quick to recognize that the war in Europe would be won or lost in the Atlantic, and that the link with the United States was of the utmost importance. His relations with President Roosevelt were excellent, and Churchill hoped that in time the US would join the Allies in the fight against Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, America could help supply Britain's pressing need for war materials. In December 1939, Churchill's reputation had received a significant boost with the defeat of the Graf Spee, and shortly after the fall of Norway, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Having warned of the dangers of Nazi Germany for more than a decade, and having vigorously opposed the appeasement of Adolf Hitler, Churchill soon made it clear that Great Britain would never surrender and never negotiate. Franklin Roosevelt had recognized the threat of Germany and Japan long before many of his countrymen. He was a strong supporter of Great Britain, but was restricted in his direct support by America's powerful isolationist lobby. Although formally reconfirming its neutrality just 2 days after Britain had declared war, the United States was quick to provide valuable support. America offered facilities for training British pilots and supplied naval escorts for Allied merchant ships in American waters. In the summer of 1940, Roosevelt announced a multi-million-dollar defense program, the largest peacetime military appropriation in American history. For Britain, the first major benefit came in September, when an initiative taken by Roosevelt resulted in the exchange of 50 American First World War destroyers in return for indefinite leases on British Caribbean bases. The scale of American aid would continue to escalate.
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves.
In March 1941, Congress would pass the Lend-Lease Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation of the entire war. The Lend-Lease Act allowed Roosevelt to increase massively US involvement in the war without compromising its valued neutrality. During the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Lend-Lease Act would supply Great Britain with a quarter of all its military equipment. In 1935, the German Navy had presented Hitler with a strategy to build up naval forces equal to those of Great Britain's within 10 years. The result would be a vast fleet of 13 battleships, 33 cruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, and 250 submarines, which, unlike the ships of the British Navy, would all be brand new. When war finally broke out in 1939, the building program had 5 years still to run. The Kriegsmarine was suddenly forced into a rapid construction program. The objective was to build a strike fleet that could blockade Great Britain and prevent American supplies from fueling British resistance. The first task of the Kriegsmarine was the protection of the German coastal merchant fleet, and to this end, the Navy laid dense minefields in the Baltic and Heligoland Bight. However, the bulk of the Reich's forces would be ranged offensively against Great Britain and her trade. The German surface ships would operate individually in the deep ocean, supplied by covert merchant vessels. Minefields would be laid outside British ports and along her coastline, and the German Navy would be aided by the Luftwaffe, which would bomb British ports and bases. But by far the most important weapons were the U-boats, which patrolled British coastal waters and the western approaches. German intelligence had calculated correctly that Great Britain needed 60 million tons of imports annually, including all its oil, just to maintain its existence. 42 million tons came from ports scattered throughout the empire, carried by the largest merchant fleet in the world along lengthy and highly vulnerable shipping lanes. In order to strangle Great Britain into surrender, it was necessary for the German Navy to sink 750,000 tons a month for a year. With 300 submarines planned, each U-boat would have to sink just 3 merchant vessels every month. It was only in late January 1939 that the British Admiralty had drawn up plans for the European war that was so clearly on the horizon. Germany and Italy were identified as the most likely enemies, and it was noted that Japan would be, at the very least, unfriendly. Great Britain's Royal Navy had not just a country to defend, but also the vital trade routes with a vast empire and with the United States. For this reason, the Royal Navy was divided into 3 main fleets: the Mediterranean, the Far Eastern, and the Home fleets. By far the strongest British naval force was the Home Fleet based at Scapa Flow. With battleships, carriers and cruisers, the Home Fleet began frequent patrols aimed at securing the Iceland Passage, the largest gateway to the North Sea. The passage was sown with 90,000 mines, and this lethal area became known to the Germans as the Rose Garden. The smaller southern gateway, the Straits of Dover, was patrolled by destroyers and was also heavily mined, which together with sunken block ships made the route impenetrable to German U-boats. A new force, the Channel Force, was created at Portsmouth, with powerful battleships to protect the endless stream of military transports travelling to and from the British Army in France. The most vital area of all was the western approaches, and its defence was coordinated from Liverpool. Based at Liverpool was a strong force of destroyers and corvettes, which would patrol ceaselessly and provide valuable convoy escorts. The convoys would be protected further by minefields along the shipping routes and further out to sea by the Royal Air Force, whose patrol zone would steadily increase as the battle progressed. The Royal Navy had also to take the fight to the enemy, and it immediately mounted a trade blockade against Germany, seizing and inspecting even neutral ships for illegal contraband. An additional strike force of fast cruisers was formed at Hull to counter any German threat in the southern stretches of the North Sea. The British Navy hoped to deny the Germans all entry into the Atlantic Ocean. The Admiralty war plans would stretch the slender resources of the British Navy to the very limit. In order to protect a vast merchant fleet of 4,000 vessels, the Royal Navy could provide just 150 destroyers. Their deployment, too, was flawed. The zone in which they patrolled was a severe underestimation of the range of modern submarines. There was a desperate shortage of air cover, as the Royal Air Force needed fighters and bombers for the defence of British airspace. Of the few that Coastal Command did possess, most were over the North Sea, waiting for the expected breakout of the German surface fleet. The first major step taken by the Royal Navy in protecting the merchant fleet was to force all departing British merchant ships into convoy. The convoy system was a defensive measure that had effectively countered the U-boat threat in the First World War. Now, the Admiralty expected it to succeed again, despite the great technological advances that had taken place in the intervening years. Modern submarines had a far greater range than their forebears and were equipped with more accurate torpedoes. An even greater advance had been made in radio communications, which allowed submarine attacks to be closely coordinated from U-boat headquarters. The British Admiralty was dangerously underestimating the mortal threat from Germany's U-boats. In the 1930s, Karl Dönitz had been faced with the difficult task of rebuilding the German U-boat service from scratch. Dönitz was an inspirational leader, himself a U-boat commander in the First World War, who instilled in his men a deep sense of camaraderie and mission. He led from the front, going to sea, and personally training the new generation of submarine commanders. It was during these exercises that Dönitz had formulated the new tactics of U-boat cooperation, which he would implement to deadly effect during the battle. Admiral Dönitz had achieved legendary status when his personal project, the attack on the Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, had succeeded so spectacularly. The continuing success of his submarine fleet ensured increased funding for more and even bigger U-boats. At the height of the battle, Admiral Karl Dönitz would be promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the entire German Navy. But such was his dedication to the undersea war that he retained full operational control of the U-boat arm. By the war's end, Dönitz would have risen so high in Hitler's estimation that he would be named his successor, becoming in May 1945 the second and last Führer of the Third Reich. Admiral Max Horten was a career sailor, a submariner who in the First World War had sunk a German cruiser, becoming the very first British submarine commander to sink an enemy vessel. Up to the outbreak of the Second World War, Horten commanded the Royal Naval Reserves and brought a force of raw recruits and aging reservists equipped with First War ships up to a state of battle readiness. By applying a powerful combination of perfectionism and ruthlessness, Horten enabled the reserves to become the mainstay of the convoy escorts. At the height of the battle, when attacks on Allied shipping reached a peak, Admiral Horten would become Commander-in-Chief of the Western Approaches, with responsibility for ensuring the safe arrival of every single convoy that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. With characteristic determination, Horten would actually take up residence in the Western Approaches headquarters at Derby House in Liverpool. Here, he created a tactical school that utilized pleasure yachts and training submarines, gaining valuable practical experience for escort commanders. Forceful and determined, Houghton was not popular with his superiors, but as one of the most able naval officers of the war, he was universally held in the highest regard. On the outbreak of war, Germany had possessed 2 modern battleships, 3 smaller pocket battleships, 1 uncompleted carrier, 9 cruisers, and almost 60 U-boats. She also had several aging battleships, 20 destroyers, and a small number of mine layers. Since then, the invasion of Norway had severely weakened the Kriegsmarine. A third of its cruiser force and half its destroyers had been sent to the bottom. These losses, and that of the Graf Spee, would be extremely difficult to replace. There were serious shortages of dockyard personnel, and every ton of steel for shipbuilding had to be won in the face of intense competition from the Air Force and Army. Although 2 more powerful battleships were soon to be commissioned, the loss of so many surface ships had made it clear to Hitler that their value was now overrated. The great successes of the U-boats, combined with the fact that they were much cheaper to build, had convinced him that Germany should put most of its naval construction effort into manufacturing submarines. In the summer of 1940, the Kriegsmarine had 51 U-boats, and with an ever-increasing number being launched, the U-boat arm looked set to achieve its aim of 300 operational submarines. The most numerous of all U-boats was the Type 7. Small and cheap to build, it had originally been designed for operations in the Mediterranean. The Type 7 was highly adaptable, and a great many versions would see service. It was fast on the surface, and twin rudders made it highly maneuverable. These qualities, and the ability to remain submerged for 18 hours, made the Type 7 ideal for night surface attacks. The Type 7 was cramped and uncomfortable to live in. But it was the workhorse of the U-boat arm, and nearly 700 would be built, more than half the total number of German submarines. The Type 7's successor was the Type 9, the early models of which were adapted and slightly enlarged 7s. However, the next versions were nearly 40 feet longer. The Type 9s had just 2 slow-running diesel engines instead of 6, which gave the boat an improved surface range at 12 knots of nearly 24,000 miles. 370 would be built during the course of the war, and the Type 9 would have the highest ratio of kills per submarine of all German U-boats. By the end of the war, Germany would launch in all nearly 1,200 U-boats of all types, and they were by far the Reich's most important maritime weapon. U-boats would eventually account for 70% of all Allied shipping losses to the Germans. The Scharnhorst, a 30,000-ton battle cruiser, had been laid down secretly in 1935, contravening the weight restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. Unlike traditional battle cruisers, which sacrificed armored protection for heavy armament, the Scharnhorst reversed the principle. With its lighter 11-inch guns, armor protection could be considerably increased. Additionally, the Scharnhorst was provided with an unprecedented number of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Scharnhorst, paired with her sister ship, the Gneisenau, sorted into the Atlantic in early 1941, where their 10,000-mile cruising radius would make them deadly as commerce raiders. Even more importantly, the attempts by the Allies to destroy them would tie up vast quantities of Allied ships, fuel, and manpower. The Focke-Wulf 200 had originally been designed before the war as a long-distance airliner. It was successfully exported and made several record endurance flights. The 200 had once crossed the Atlantic Ocean non-stop in less than 24 hours. It was the Japanese armed forces who had first recognized the aircraft's reconnaissance potential, and in 1940, the Germans introduced their own military version, the Condor. Throughout the battle, Condors would prove highly effective, both as spotters for U-boats and as bombers. For much of the war, it was Germany's only four-engined bomber. Even with a huge 4,000-pound payload, the Condor could remain airborne for 14 hours, enabling it to menace Britain's shipping lanes far into the Atlantic. The Condor was dangerously prone to structural failures, and many aircraft were lost in landing accidents. It was lightly armored, and with just 3 machine guns, was highly vulnerable to other aircraft. Nevertheless, nearly 300 Condors were built, and they earned a formidable reputation among Allied sailors. The secret raiders were German merchant ships, disguised as neutral or Allied traders, and armed with old First World War guns. Dispatched into the Atlantic, the vessels operated alone, preying on unsuspecting Allied shipping. During the course of the war, 11 merchants would be converted into raiders, and many would patrol the sea lanes of the Atlantic. Their greatest success, like the battlecruiser commerce raiders, was in diverting Allied resources away from convoy protection. Of all the secret marauders, the most destructive was Atlantis, known to British intelligence as Raider C. Manned with some of the very best crews the Kriegsmarine could muster, the Atlantis would be responsible for sinking 22 Allied merchant vessels, in voyages eventually totaling more than 100,000 miles. Before going into combat in the Atlantic Ocean, every U-boat officer, engineer, and rating had to have passed through an elite training school, secretly established in 1933. Their training was rigorous. Every single U-boat procedure had to become completely instinctive before there was any kind of tactical schooling. Live torpedoes could only be fired once a crew had carried out 66 attacks on the surface and the same number submerged. Practicing 8 attacks a day and 6 at night for an exhausting 5 days a week pushed the U-boat men to the very limit of their physical and mental capacity. The arduous training undergone by the men of the U-boat service encouraged their belief that they were an elite corps within the already elite navy. Their beards were not just a practical measure to save valuable fresh water, but a symbol of their elevated status. The sense of being specially chosen for one of the most dangerous and demanding jobs in the armed forces was highly attractive to dedicated young Nazis. As a result, the U-boat arm was more deeply politicized and more driven by ideology than any other branch of the Wehrmacht. In the spring of 1940, when the U-boats returned home from their first sorties against the British, they became the new heroes of the Third Reich. Berliners turned out in their thousands, and entire crews were taken to the Chancellery to meet personally with their delighted Führer. The U-boat arm was by far the most dangerous profession for a German to be in. Of the 39,000 sailors that went to sea in U-boats, nearly 70% would die. This was the highest casualty rate of any service of any nation in the Second World War. During the 1920s and 30s, the Royal Navy had suffered from severe financial restraints. In 1939, all but 3 of the 15 capital ships in service dated from the First World War. Cutbacks had steadily reduced the Navy's design and manufacturing capacity, slowing down the building of new ships, and innovations such as carrier aircraft had been seriously neglected. Historically, the primary role of the Royal Navy had been to ensure the safety of British commerce. But the lean interwar years had left the imperial ports and the lengthy shipping lanes inadequately protected. When war finally came, the Royal Navy found itself with the full-time job of protecting the largest merchant fleet in the world, at a time when even its basic stocks of fuel and ammunition were below battle readiness. Ironically, one of the main causes of the Navy's meager convoy protection was the successful development of an underwater listening device, ASDIC, or sonar. Experiments in the 1930s had convinced the British Admiralty that this secret weapon could make a convoy invulnerable to submarine attack. However, the experiments had been flawed. Conducted in ideal weather conditions, they took no account of the harsh realities of the Atlantic Ocean. In spite of its weaknesses and its heavy losses in the war so far, the Royal Navy, with 14 battleships and carriers, 57 cruisers and over 100 destroyers, remained one of the largest naval forces in the world. As the Admiralty began fully to realize that the entire war could be lost in the Atlantic Ocean, convoy defense would at last be given the highest priority. The Flower-class corvette was a small, armored escort vessel, based on an old 19th century design for a whale catcher. It was easy to build and extremely cheap, at just half the cost of a destroyer. An additional advantage was that many improvements could conveniently be made while the ships were still being built. The corvette was basically a seagoing coastal ship, poorly suited to deep-water voyages in the Atlantic Ocean. It rolled severely, quickly exhausting even the fittest crews. Although too slow to overhaul a surfaced U-boat, the Flower-class corvette could cross the full width of the Atlantic Ocean without refueling. With a 4-inch gun, 6 anti-aircraft machine guns, and 40 depth charges, the corvette would become operational during the most severe escort shortage of the war. Its cheap, fast construction, its long endurance, and its small but deadly armory would make the Flower one of the most important Allied weapons of the battle, the mainstay of the British and Canadian convoy defences. The American consolidated B-24 Liberator, a powerful long-range bomber, was one of the most successful heavy bombers ever, and with over 18,000 built, the most numerous American aircraft in history. It was first supplied to RAF Coastal Command in June 1941, and the British would eventually receive almost 1,700. The Liberator was cold and drafty and earned a reputation for breaking up easily on crash landings. But with a range of more than 2,200 miles, the aircraft, in British and American hands, would at last seal the mid-Atlantic air gap, giving convoys full protection throughout their entire voyage. Later in the battle, they would be fitted with powerful spotlights called Lee lights, and a revolutionary 10-centimeter radar, which would dramatically enhance their effectiveness. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the B-24 would become one of the most valuable weapons in the Allied arsenal. The short Sunderland, a pre-war passenger flying boat, had been RAF Coastal Command's main frontline patrol aircraft since 1938. It was a large and graceful 4-engined machine, which had an endurance of 14 hours. Almost 750 would be built, seeing service with Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand squadrons. The Sunderland's range and 2,000-pound bomb load made it a formidable anti-submarine weapon. But its greatest advantage was its versatility. Many Allied sailors and airmen owed their lives to its search and rescue capabilities, while as a bomber, it would be responsible for nearly 40 U-boat kills. However, the Sunderland's greatest role was as a convoy escort. The German submarines feared air attack more than anything, and time after time, the mere sight of the Sunderland would force them to dive, not only slowing them down, but greatly increasing their fuel consumption, and so reducing their effective range by hundreds of miles. The Sunderland was slow, with an average cruising speed of just 134 miles per hour. But this was more than compensated for by 10 machine guns and thick armor plating. As a result, the aircraft earned legendary status with the Germans, who nicknamed it the Flying Porcupine. The American Liberty ships had been designed with one guiding principle in mind: to build more ships than the Germans could sink. The result was a large, sturdy, if inelegant freighter, constructed easily and rapidly. It was assembled with 30,000 standardized prefabricated parts that did not need to be manufactured in a shipyard. The Liberty ship prototype had taken 244 days to build, but within months, the average construction time was reduced to just 42 days. In November 1942, a public relations exercise would be staged, with the Liberty ship completed in an incredible 4 days and 15 hours. Nearly 3,000 would eventually be built, and of these, 200 would be sunk. The many millions of tons of cargo carried across the Atlantic Ocean by Liberty ships would be of inestimable value to the Allies in winning the battle and the war. In 1939, the officers and men of the Royal Navy were some of the most able, well-trained sailors in the world. The already high quality of recruits was raised even further when Winston Churchill swept away many of the old class prejudices and immeasurably boosted service morale. Shortly before the outbreak of war, the Navy's ranks were swelled by the men of the Royal Naval Reserve. The force grew from 119,000 to nearly 200,000. The inexperienced reserves soon became the backbone of the convoy escorts. The opening skirmishes of the war at sea ensured that they were trained in action, and by the time the battle began in earnest, they would be as hardened as their long-service colleagues. For the sailors of the United States Navy, the dangers and hardships of battle were being endured long before their government declared war. They shared not just the treachery of the ocean itself, but also the U-boat terror, which often struck indiscriminately. US sailors would die at sea months before the carnage of Pearl Harbor. Ashore, they were forbidden to talk of their exploits and received no public recognition. Of all the men crossing the Atlantic, none were so fundamental to the Allied effort as the men of the merchant navies. Many convoys were composed of ships from several nations, and often each ship was crewed by a mix of races and nationalities. Most were just ordinary civilians, suddenly forced under military authority and thrust into a terrifying battle of attrition. For all Allied sailors, the already harsh Atlantic was made worse by the constant pressures. The vigilance needed just to maintain station in convoy was compounded by the endless, almost unendurable tension of waiting for the inevitable attack. Ships went down in moments. Cold water killed men in minutes, and the dense Atlantic fogs could foil any attempt at rescue. Worst of all, the convoy could stop for no one. During the course of the battle, merchant sailors would suffer a higher casualty rate than any of the Allied armed forces. Since September 1939, when the British Expeditionary Force had begun crossing to France, 13 British divisions had steadily been fortifying the French border against German attack. Still, Germany had made no aggressive moves towards France, and many people now believed this long period of inaction meant that the war would soon be concluded through negotiation. This illusion was suddenly shattered on May the 9th, 1940, when the Wehrmacht unleashed 2.5 million men against France and the Low Countries. The Allied armies, taken by surprise, were soon in full retreat, harried all the way to the northern coast of France. Hundreds of thousands became trapped in an ever-decreasing pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The Royal Navy launched an audacious and brilliantly successful rescue mission, saving nearly 350,000 British and French troops from certain death or capture. The Germans turned south, and within weeks, France had sued for peace. Never before had the world balance of power shifted so dramatically. Britain now stood alone, her last ally in Europe gone. Her trade routes across the Atlantic were the key to her very survival. The Dunkirk evacuation had cost the British Navy 6 destroyers sunk and 26 badly damaged, leaving less than 80 at sea. Even worse, Great Britain herself was now threatened with invasion, and more escorts had to be diverted to watch the coasts. For Germany, the outlook could not have been better. Newly acquired naval bases on the French Atlantic coast dramatically reduced the U-boats' traveling time. Now, more U-boats could take up station, and they could remain for even longer. With Allied convoy escorts weaker than they had ever been, the U-boats seemed poised to win the war for Germany. On May the 15th, 1940, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat arm, had dispatched a single submarine into the Atlantic, the first to go back since the fall of Norway. The U-37 was on an unusual mission, to raise morale by proving that British shipping was still highly vulnerable. In just 2 weeks, with torpedoes and deck guns, the U-37 sank 11 merchant ships, making it the most successful tour of the battle so far. News of U-37's spectacular triumph spread rapidly through the service and gave an immeasurable boost to morale. Dönitz was delighted and immediately ordered that 2 U-boat flotillas be made ready for a return to the rich hunting ground of the Atlantic Ocean. Since the beginning of the war 9 months earlier, the German Navy had lost nearly 20 U-boats. Of these, only a handful had actually been sunk during attacks on merchant ships, while most had been lost to mines or in accidents. All had been replaced by June 1940. The U-boat construction program was currently delivering 13 every month, but was given a considerable boost by the occupation of France. The capture of French raw materials would provide the Navy with an abundance of previously scarce metals, especially copper, which was vital in submarine production. The U-boats continued to operate from their traditional base at Wilhelmshaven and the Norwegian ports. But the main Atlantic fleet would soon strike from U-boat bases being constructed along the French west coast, at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and Bordeaux. Admiral Karl Dönitz would set up his new headquarters just outside Lorient at Kurneval. For the next year, 30 submarines would operate from these bases. The German fleet would soon be joined by 18 Italian submarines under German operational control. Luftwaffe units of Focke-Wulf Condors and Heinkel 111s would fly from airfields at Merignac near Bordeaux and Stavanger in Norway. While at Kiel, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were undergoing repairs and would soon be ready to sortie, as would the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer in Wilhelmshaven. The battleship Bismarck and the cruiser Prince Eugen were in trials in the Baltic and would not be ready for 6 months, but their mere presence was enough to alarm the British authorities. The Condors could strike over 1,400 kilometers into the Atlantic, almost as far as Iceland. The U-boats would patrol a wide area, initially operating to 25 degrees west, and this would steadily increase as the battle progressed. Also, the first wave of secret raiders had already set sail, and were now traveling south through the Atlantic Ocean. The capture of the French Atlantic ports not only saved the German and Italian U-boats a week's traveling time, but the new bases also proved highly effective repair yards. Normally, of the total number of U-boats in service at any one time, a third would be traveling to or from station, a third would be in dock undergoing refits and repairs, leaving only the final third actually on operations. The new French bases were far more efficient than the overworked ports of the German homeland, and the number of U-boats on operations instead of in dock would rise considerably. Even as the Germans were completing the conquest of France, Hitler had already turned his sights towards Great Britain. While the U-boats were set to cut Britain's Atlantic lifeline, the Luftwaffe began bombing her ports and channel shipping. As British naval forces had been diverted to watch the coastline for a threatened German invasion, many merchant vessels had been left defenseless. Every effort was made to help them protect themselves, and as much of the merchant fleet as possible was now given armor protection. Many merchant ships were also armed, and their crews were trained to fight. In June 1940, nearly half the Royal Navy's 80 destroyers were deployed in the screen thrown around the south coast of Great Britain to watch for a German invasion. Even more were utilized in formations called search and patrol groups. These had a roving brief to sweep the ocean for prowling U-boats. This left the Western Approaches Command responsible for the defense of all Atlantic convoys, with too few destroyers and less than 50 sloops and corvettes. The Western Approaches warships were soon to be based in the ports of Liverpool, Greenock and Londonderry. Later in the battle, Admiral Max Houghton would become Commander-in-Chief with his headquarters at Liverpool. The Western Approaches warships initially could only escort the outward-bound convoys as far as 12 degrees west, 100 miles west of Ireland. At the 12th meridian, the convoy would have to continue the rest of the 4,000-kilometer journey alone, or with just light defense. The Western Approaches escorts would wait at the edge of their patrol limit to meet the more important homeward-bound convoys. There were two types of homeward sailing convoys. The faster convoys formed up at the Canadian port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and were coded HX. The slow convoys formed up at Sydney, Cape Breton, and were coded SC. For their protection, the Royal Canadian Navy presently had less than 10 destroyers, which could only provide the convoys with a light escort for about 400 miles. In order to keep the European conflict out of American waters, the United States maintained the Neutrality Patrol out to 300 miles east, which with 8 destroyer groups and 5 Catalina squadrons was for the time being enough to deter any long-range U-boats. East Atlantic air cover was provided by less than 30 RAF Coastal Command squadrons flying from Great Britain. British and Canadian resources were stretched to the full, and even with American help, the convoys faced a huge gap in the middle of the Atlantic, with little surface and no air protection. In late May 1940, the first wave of U-boats, refitted, rearmed, and with well-rested crews, set sail for the Atlantic. Many Allied merchant ships still continued to travel independently, without the benefits of convoy protection, and so were utterly defenseless. The only hope for these independents lay in the vast emptiness of the ocean, where the sheer expanse of sea made discovery almost impossible. However, the enemy U-boats had several critical advantages. They were equipped with good radio direction finders, which pinpointed the positions of merchant radio transmits. At closer ranges, hydrophones picked up and amplified the sound of ships' engines and propellers. Just as important as the detection equipment, the U-boats often had the benefit of good air reconnaissance, and above all, they were provided with excellent intelligence. British naval radio transmissions were intercepted, and many could already be decoded, giving away convoy positions and headings. German secret agents had been placed in most ports of the British Empire, and the U-boats were told about departing vessels. In addition, American insurance companies still did business with neutral European countries, and German agents could learn the origins and destinations of particularly valuable cargoes. In June alone, the U-boats had sunk 64 merchant ships. At 261,000 tons, this was the most destructive month of the war so far. In July, even that figure was beaten, when the first of the French U-boat bases became fully operational. The devastation continued throughout August, and far outweighed Allied construction of new ships. With as yet just 30 submarines, the U-boat arm was already achieving a third of its monthly target. In the battle so far, 80% of nearly 150 merchant ships sunk had been independents, vessels sailing out of convoy. The U-boats had only to find the trade routes and pick off their victims from a predictable succession of targets. But many merchants were now sailing in convoy, which meant that the U-boat could either be deterred by an armed defense or fail altogether to intercept the ships. With vessels coming from many different ports, each convoy took a long time to form. Its ships assembled for several weeks at the designated harbor before departure. Once there were enough ships and enough escort vessels, Western Approach's headquarters would allocate it the safest known route across the Atlantic. On departing, only a handful of the convoy's senior officers would know its course and destination. In a typical convoy, the merchant ships would form 7 columns, each half a mile apart. The inner 3 columns, with the most valuable or explosive cargoes, would contain 5 vessels, and the more vulnerable outer columns would contain 4. In column, each ship sailed 600 yards apart. The formation was a broad front rectangle and would occupy a relatively small sea area of 6 square miles. The box-like formation had been adopted after it was found that long columns tended to string out, not only greatly increasing the visibility of the convoy, but leaving the tail enders highly vulnerable. The main benefit of the compact rectangle was the resulting short perimeter, along which 4 or more escort vessels patrolled. The size of a convoy could be considerably increased without the need for a corresponding increase in the number of escorting warships. Maneuvers in convoy were always dangerous, especially for inexperienced crews, and so were kept to a minimum. The Commodore, in a central ship towards the front, ordered the course changes. Early in the battle, this was brought about by the ships on the inside of the turn slowing down, while the whole formation wheeled around. However, this method forced the convoy to lose valuable speed. Later in the battle, the wheel was often replaced by a technique that had started out purely as an emergency maneuver. This was a sudden 45-degree turn, carried out simultaneously by all vessels. It greatly increased the risk of collision and left the convoy in an echelon that was disconcerting to the ship's captains. But critically, the convoy lost no speed, and with experience, it could be carried out with the ships still maintaining station. Convoy safety ultimately depended on strong escorts, and especially on secure communications. With such a shortage of escort vessels, security was more important than ever. Incapable of fighting it out, to survive, the convoys had to evade the U-boats altogether. By late August 1940, the German Navy was able to intercept and decrypt British naval signals early enough to mount powerful attacks. This allowed Admiral Dönitz to try out long-planned tactics to defeat the convoys. Dönitz, as a First World War U-boat commander, had already fought against convoys, and anticipating that the Allies would once again use the system, had developed a tactic to defeat it. Dönitz now had enough U-boats and good enough intelligence to implement the Rudel tactic, better known as the Wolf Pack. The Wolf Pack, given advance warning by German intelligence, would be disposed in a chain, often several hundred miles long, across the suspected course of a convoy. When one U-boat sighted the merchant ships, it then radioed the convoy's position and course back to headquarters. Headquarters then alerted all the nearest U-boats and vectored them towards the target. Once the U-boats found their prey, each commander was free to choose his own position from which to attack. Most remained a safe distance beyond the escorts and launched a fan of torpedoes at the convoy's flank. They hoped that out of 4 or 5 torpedoes aimed into the middle of the convoy, 1 or more would hit a ship. However, the bravest U-boat commanders waited for nightfall. They sailed slowly on the surface, evading the underwater detectors, steamed straight through the escort perimeter screen and right in amongst the merchant vessels. The U-boat's low silhouette and the inexperience of convoy lookouts enabled the commander to wreak havoc by picking off individual targets at almost point-blank range. As soon as a submarine attack began, the merchant vessels and their escorts immediately fired hundreds of flares and starshot, lighting up the sky in an attempt to reveal the U-boat's position. Even if they did see the enemy, at such short range, the escorts were unable to depress their deck guns low enough to hit the target. The escorts could still ram the submarine, but often, before they had a chance to do so, the U-boat had dived. The problem for the escorts now was finding the enemy. The German submarines usually stayed shallow, knowing that the Allied ASDIC underwater detector beam was at its most unreliable near the surface. Even if the escorts did discover the U-boat, they could still only fire depth charges from the stern. This meant they had to sail right over the enemy, and in so doing would lose ASDIC contact, and therefore any accuracy they might have had. At close range, the U-boats had all the advantages. The most steel-nerved U-boat commanders remained near the surface and close to a merchant ship. They bided their time until the panic was over, then quietly slipped away. The first real chance for the Kriegsmarine to form wolf packs came in early September 1940. The tactic soon proved devastatingly successful. Again and again, the U-boats ambushed lightly defended convoys, and by the end of the month, 59 Allied merchant ships had been sunk, the highest monthly total yet. In early October, German intelligence decrypted several British naval signals that gave them 4 days' notice of a slow convoy, SC-7, sailing from Canada. The Germans knew not just its time of departure, but also its course and speed. The nearest U-boats were immediately formed into a powerful wolf pack and placed in the path of the oncoming convoy. Convoy SC-7 contained 34 merchant ships and was sailing south of Iceland, escorted by a single sloop. On October the 15th, U-124, one of a screen of U-boats several miles apart, sighted a straggler, sank her, and the next morning found the rest of the convoy. It radioed headquarters and quickly sank 3 more merchant ships before being forced to submerge by the escort. U-boat headquarters immediately vectored in 6 submarines. An additional sloop and a Flower corvette arrived from Western Approaches Command, but to little effect. Over the next 2 days, the 6 U-boats managed to sink 16 of the 30 remaining merchant ships. 60% of the entire convoy, more than 100,000 tons, were destroyed by the Wolfpack, without the loss of a single submarine. In the 4 months from June to October 1940, called the Happy Time, the U-boats had sunk 274 ships at 1.5 million tons for the loss of just 6 submarines. The wolf packs had comprehensively demonstrated their superiority over the convoy defenses. At this rate of destruction, Great Britain, despite enforcing a strict rationing program, was going to be 6 million tons of imports short of the minimum required to maintain existence. In November 1940, the U-boat's happy time finally came to an end, when fierce storms sweeping through the North Atlantic forced many to withdraw. Allied countermeasures had also begun to have an effect. Convoys had been routed further north towards Iceland, and merchant radio codes had been altered. The weather, which had driven many U-boats home, had also caused Hitler to abandon his plans to invade England. And many small warships, released from the protective screen thrown around Britain's south coast, became available as convoy escorts. By now, most of the 50 American First World War destroyers, exchanged for British bases, had arrived at western approaches. In early 1941, the U-boats once more returned to battle, refreshed and confident in the belief that victory could soon be won. However, the Allied improvements in convoy defense were now starting to have an effect, and to their surprise, the U-boats were far less successful than before. Most convoys escaped the German submarines unscathed. The U-boat arm suffered a further setback in March, when its 3 most brilliant commanders were lost in the space of 2 weeks. Gunther Prien, hero of Scapa Flow, was killed having sunk 33 ships. Joachim Schöpke destroyed 37 ships before being sunk by a British escort. And Otto Kretschmer, greatest ace of all, was captured, having destroyed 44 ships, the most successful naval commander in history. However, this temporary and unexpected low point in the fortunes of the U-boat arm was more than offset by the successes of the German surface navy and the Luftwaffe. In February 1941, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had left their base at Kiel and had broken through the British blockade into the Atlantic. They wreaked havoc on Allied shipping, destroying 22 ships in just 6 weeks. More importantly, the warships caused widespread fear and disrupted the entire convoy system. The result was a severe drop in British imports. At the same time as the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were on operations, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer was preying on convoys in the North Atlantic. Further afield, the heavy cruiser Hipper had been prowling along the African coast, while in the south, the secret raiders were causing panic, forcing the Allies to hunt them down and diverting valuable warships from escort duty. The Luftwaffe, too, had increased its activity in the Atlantic, and Hitler had put Group 40 under the direct operational control of the Kriegsmarine. The result was 27 merchant ships sunk by aircraft in February alone. Allied leaders were deeply concerned at the growing level of cooperation between the German Navy and Air Force. Complete disaster for the Allies was only averted by the capture of a German patrol boat with its code books intact. The Allied codebreakers could now pinpoint the positions of many U-boats. For a time, convoys could simply be diverted clear out of the way of enemy-infested waters. Since the beginning of the battle, the British had been researching how best to use the few escort ships they had. One result was the development of the escort group. The escort group was perfected by Captain John F. Walker, who was later knighted for killing 2 submarines in a single morning. The group was a formation of small warships, which, unlike the failed search and patrol groups, would operate in close consort with the convoys. Later in the battle, when there were more than enough warships, the more successful escort groups would be given complete independence and renamed support groups. These would move from convoy to convoy, protecting the merchant ships through the most dangerous stretches of ocean. The escort group traveled in close consort with a convoy and was usually made up of corvettes and destroyers. When a U-boat was detected, the group would break off from the convoy, leaving just enough permanent escorts to secure the perimeter. The group would bring maximum firepower to bear on the submarine, inflicting as much damage as possible and forcing it to dive. The escorts then had to find the submarine with their ASDIC underwater detectors. The warships sailed line abreast 3 or 4 miles apart, maximizing the area of sea covered. Once ASDIC contact was made, then the escorts launched a barrage of depth charges, either destroying the U-boat or forcing it to the surface, where the wounded U-boat would be shelled or rammed. No escort group would ever give up the hunt until its prey was destroyed or had clearly escaped. The first 4 escort groups at western approaches supported convoys as far as 35 degrees west. In May, the Royal Canadian Navy received 8 new destroyers and 20 corvettes, which meant that now, for the very first time in the battle, the convoys could be given full surface protection right across the Atlantic. Air cover too had been considerably increased, and RAF Sunderlands and Hudsons had begun flying from Iceland, providing cover out to 400 miles. Additional air bases had also been completed at Gibraltar, Sierra Leone, and Halifax. As a result of the growing strength of Allied defences in the North Atlantic, Dönitz decided to transfer the U-boats to less well-protected waters further south. While the U-boat force had struggled against ever stronger convoy defences, the German surface fleet had also faced considerable difficulties. After returning from successful tours, the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and the Admiral Scheer were all blockaded in Kiel by the RAF and the Royal Navy. Far worse for Germany, Bismarck, the Reich's most powerful warship, was attacked by British battleships George V and Rodney and sunk off the southern coast of Ireland. She had never even seen the convoys she was meant to annihilate. By late spring 1941, the Allies had successfully contained or destroyed the bulk of the German surface navy, finally ending the threat of German warships. Every month, convoy defences had been steadily improved. Yet in May 1941, 66 merchant ships were sunk, 25 of which had been sailing in convoy. The escort groups were growing ever more efficient, but as yet, there were just not enough warships to turn the tide of battle. The Allies' defence against the Wolf Pack was nowhere near foolproof. In mid-1941, 8 U-boats were transferred to the Arctic Ocean. Hitler, in his war against the Soviet Union, needed to destroy supplies being sent to the Russians from the west. The transfer of submarines away from the Atlantic convoys meant a desperately needed reprieve for Great Britain. Imports rose to 1 million tons a week, well above the minimum required. The Allies consolidated their gains by once more changing the convoy routes. Air patrols over the Bay of Biscay were also stepped up to catch more U-boats entering and leaving their French bases. In June 1941, in a move that startled the Germans, the United States declared that Allied convoys containing non-American merchant ships would now be escorted by American warships. Germany protested at this breach of international law, but to no effect. American destroyers would respond with force to any U-boat threat. In the new Western Hemisphere defense zone, the United States Navy now escorted convoys as far as 22 degrees west, halfway across the Atlantic. Air cover was growing stronger every month, but was still incomplete. The mid-Atlantic air gap still left convoys highly vulnerable to submarine attack. In September, the Germans changed their naval codes, and Dönitz immediately transferred 5 wolf packs back up north into the air gap. By the end of the month, 71% of all merchant ships destroyed had been sunk by wolf packs. This was the highest percentage of the battle yet, and proved that when supplied with good intelligence, the wolf packs were still unstoppable. With the devastating September attacks, Admiral Dönitz had seized the initiative from the Allies. Again and again, the wolf pack had comprehensively defeated the convoy. However, in October, Hitler once more intervened in the U-boat war. Over the next 8 weeks, the Führer ordered 16 submarines to the aid of Axis forces in North Africa, aiming to cut the British Army's supply lines in the Mediterranean. The diversion of so many U-boats away from the Atlantic once again gave the Allied convoys an unexpected respite. In November, just 17 merchant ships were sunk in the North Atlantic. Only 4 were sunk in December. For 2 full months, the convoys had crossed the Atlantic almost unmolested, greatly increasing British supply levels. On December the 7th, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese Navy. The United States declared war on Japan, and 4 days later, Germany, in support of her Axis partner, declared war on America. For the German U-boats, here was a rich new source of unprotected shipping. Cargo vessels bound for Britain were no longer the only submarine targets. Now, ships in American waters could be attacked. Admiral Dönitz knew that every Allied vessel sunk, whether British or American, would have to be replaced, costing the enemy precious time, raw materials, and manpower. The main priority of the United States Navy was in the Pacific Ocean, and it had as yet made few plans for participating in the Battle of the Atlantic. Domestic merchant ships continued to sail independently, believing it would be some time, if ever, before the war actually reached American waters. For the protection of the merchant fleet, the US Navy possessed just 3 destroyer flotillas and 5 Catalina squadrons to patrol a 1,500-mile coastline. Meanwhile, matters were not helped by a sudden wave of public hysteria, overwhelming the authorities with thousands of reported submarine and enemy invasion sightings. There were no city blackouts as chambers of commerce refused to jeopardize their valuable tourist trade. The bright lights of East Coast cities like Miami, Atlantic City, and New York made navigation simple for the U-boats prowling offshore. But worst of all, the bright lights perfectly silhouetted merchant ships for the U-boat commanders. Operation Paukenschlag, or Drum Roll, the German opening offensive against the United States, could for the time being only be carried out by 9 Type 9s, the only German submarines which had the range to operate on the eastern seaboard of the United States. The submarines were ordered not to shoot at any targets, unless especially large, until they had reached their stations along the east coast of New York, Boston, Portland, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. On January the 12th, 1942, when all 9 U-boats were in position, Dönitz ordered that the offensive begin. The first victim was a British tanker just off Cape Cod. Within 4 weeks of the start of the offensive, the U-boats operating independently destroyed 50 merchant ships, nearly 300,000 tons. This spectacular success convinced Hitler to allow more U-boats to be transferred from the Arctic and Mediterranean. In addition, 20 Type 7s, modified for longer ranges, were now able to reach Canada. Eastern Atlantic U-boat operations slowly spread as far as the Caribbean. In February, the U-boats sank another 55 merchants, much of whose cargo was ultimately bound for Britain. Over 1 million tons of American shipping was destroyed before a single U-boat was sunk. With sinkings now running at 627,000 tons a month, the United States was forced to resort to desperate measures. Firstly, in a reversal of Lend-Lease, Great Britain sent the US Navy 10 corvettes and 24 armed trawlers, complete with their trained and experienced crews. Then, along the east coast, a series of interlocking convoy operations was begun, and as resources allowed, these were continually expanded. For the first time, city blackouts were ordered by the federal government. Finally, the authorities took back 70 aircraft intended for the British Air Force and instead employed them on patrols along the coast. Week after week, all these improvements slowly took effect, and the number of sinkings began to fall. The Germans' second happy time was over. Dönitz knew that the U-boats' concentration in American waters had given a respite to British Atlantic convoys. U-boats operating along the US seaboard used up much of their supplies in just getting there, and could only remain on actual operations for 1/3 of the time they could operate in the western approaches. The U-boats still had to destroy 700,000 tons of shipping a month in order to defeat Britain, and Dönitz decided it was time to return to the Eastern Atlantic and reform the wolf packs. Great Britain's transfer of armed trawlers and corvettes to the United States had reduced the number of escorts available for British convoys, especially in the Eastern Atlantic. The weakness was only offset by improvements in existing escort ships and patrol aircraft. Powerful spotlights were fitted to long-range aircraft and greatly helped their ability to hunt U-boats, while at sea, the first forward-throwing, multi-barrel depth charge called a Hedgehog was proving highly successful. The Hedgehog removed the escort's main weakness in close-range combat and finally allowed the warship to fire depth charges while still maintaining ASDIC contact. By the summer of 1942, the number of Allied escort groups had increased substantially, and every month, yet more would plough the convoy routes. Because their ships and crews worked together voyage after voyage, they became highly effective teams, and the escort groups soon developed into supreme U-boat killers. By now, several small aircraft carriers had begun operating across the Atlantic, and their Martlets and Avengers were not only long-range eyes for the convoy escorts, but were also highly effective weapons in their own right. Despite all the improvements in convoy defense, the U-boat arm continued to go from strength to strength. After the second happy time, morale was the highest it had ever been. There had also been a series of logistical improvements. Special supply submarines called milch cows had been used on the American operations. These large submarines resupplied the U-boats in mid-ocean, enabling the U-boats to remain on station for even longer. There had also been important technical advances. Many U-boats were re-equipped with new and deadly acoustic torpedoes that homed in on merchant ship propellers. Metok's radar detectors were now fitted as standard and alerted the crew when they had been discovered by a convoy escort, giving them enough time to dive and escape. By the autumn of 1942, Allied air coverage along the Atlantic convoy routes had been considerably increased. But in the north, where the bulk of British imports crossed, a large air gap still remained, known to Allied sailors as the Black Pit. It was close to this air gap that Dönitz concentrated his U-boats, 30 in American waters and 40 in the western approaches, including several strong wolf packs. In early November 1942, SC-107, sailing from New York with 42 ships, was attacked in the largest convoy battle of the year. In just 4 days, 15 Allied merchant vessels were sunk, and altogether, the U-boats destroyed more than 80,000 tons. In the last 6 months of 1942, throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean, the U-boats had sunk a massive 575 Allied merchant ships. If the Germans could maintain this rate of destruction, the British war effort would collapse. The building of new merchant ships had fallen behind schedule. But most dangerous of all, Britain had just 3 months' supply of fuel oil left. For the Allies, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a crisis point. Allied commanders knew that it was their failure to sink large numbers of submarines that lay behind their constant reverses. They had made a concerted effort to destroy U-boats by bombing their yards and bases. But the U-boat bases had been equipped with huge reinforced concrete bunkers, or pens. The pens were completely impervious to even the largest bombs. At sea, in 1942, the Allies had sunk 87 U-boats, higher than the year before, but averaging less than 8 a month. The Germans had built 3 for every 1 lost. And during the year, the number of operational submarines had risen from 91 to 212. For Admiral Dönitz, although 1942 had ended on a high note, he was not totally confident. Dönitz feared Allied technical improvements. He had learned of the powerful searchlights fitted to maritime aircraft and was beginning to suspect the existence of the new Allied 10-centimeter radar. To form wolf packs and intercept the convoys, U-boats needed their full range and their full speed. Therefore, they had to stay surfaced as long as possible. Dönitz knew that if the Allied countermeasures could keep the U-boats from traveling on the surface, then the wolf pack would be defeated. To prevent this, the U-boats were fitted with more powerful anti-aircraft guns and ordered to fight it out instead of diving. And once again, U-boat radio codes were changed, maintaining the intelligence advantage for the Germans. In early 1943, unexpectedly fierce storms once more swept through the Atlantic, reducing submarine activity, and for a short time, the convoys went unmolested. It would be spring before the weather lifted and the offensive could be resumed. In March, Dönitz sent all his available U-boats into the ocean and stationed them in the very heart of the mid-Atlantic air gap. As the U-boats pounced, they proved again and again that Allied air cover was still inadequate. Convoys were as vulnerable as ever. U-boats tore into a string of merchant ships, achieving some rapid and spectacular victories. Then, just a few days into the renewed offensive, German codebreakers informed Admiral Dönitz of the course and position of two convoys carrying vital war materials bound from the United States. This gave the Admiral time to set up the largest and most devastating Wolfpack ambush of the entire battle. German intelligence indicated that two eastbound convoys had left New York, SC-122, and the faster HX-229. On March the 12th, Dönitz deployed the biggest concentration of submarines ever. 38 U-boats in 3 Wolfpacks, coded Raubgraf, Stürmer, and Dränger. The slower convoy passed through the 600-mile-long Raubgraf unnoticed, and HX-229 outran it. But in the early hours of the 16th, a submarine from Raubgraf returning home with engine trouble steamed right into the midst of the unfortunate 229. The U-boat radioed the convoy's course back to headquarters, and immediately every single U-boat in the 3 Wolfpacks was ordered to converge and intercept. The resulting onslaught lasted for 4 days and stretched over 600 miles of ocean. The U-boats sank 21 ships, which at 141,000 tons, made it the most destructive convoy battle of the entire war. The crippling loss inflicted on HX-229 and SC-122 was the low point of a terrible month for the Allies. In the first 3 weeks of March, 97 merchant ships were sunk, 500,000 tons destroyed, nearly twice as much as the Allies could build in the same time. All Germany's hopes in the U-boats had been justified. Although Dönitz and his crews sensed triumph, the latest successes of the U-boats were not evidence of an imminent German victory. These successes, however dramatic, were due to a sudden combination of unusual circumstances. In fact, although neither side yet knew it, the Allies had already turned the tide of battle. By March the 21st, 1943, merchant ship losses had become so great that several senior British commanders believed the convoy system defeated, and that Allied leaders should start trying to find an alternative defense. But the commander-in-chief of the Western approaches, Admiral Max Horton, was confident that the U-boat successes over the last few weeks would not continue. For a time, the German code changes had blinded the Allies, but the new U-boat cipher had taken only 10 days to break. From now on, the majority of convoys could once again simply be rerouted around known Wolfpack positions. What was more, increased air support, particularly with the very long-range Liberators, finally sealed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Good intelligence, powerful escorts, and the closure of the infamous Black Pit all combined to make a sudden and decisive impact on the course of the battle. In the last week of March, just 2 more merchant ships were sunk in the North Atlantic. There was no longer any part of the ocean where the German submarines were safe from Allied bombers. By stopping the U-boats traveling on the surface, the Allies defeated the Wolfpack. Having crushed the U-boat's most successful tactic, the Allies now went all out to destroy the submarines and eliminate them altogether from the ocean. Bombing raids against the U-boat construction yards were stepped up, and one raid on Bremen alone destroyed the hulls of 9 submarines. Air patrols over the Bay of Biscay were increased, and for the escort vessels, the convoys were now a useful bait. The merchant ships attracted the U-boats, which the warships could then hunt down and destroy. The result of the Allied offensive against the U-boats was devastating. By the end of March, 16 submarines had been sunk for the loss of 95 merchant ships. In April, the Allies sank 17 submarines. In May, Dönitz had more U-boats in the Atlantic than ever before, but to no avail. That month, the Allies destroyed an incredible 47 U-boats. For the very first time in the entire battle, the Allies had destroyed more submarines than the number of merchant ships lost. Such a price was too severe for the Germans, and finally, on May the 24th, 1943, Admiral Dönitz was forced to order the withdrawal of the surviving U-boats from the Atlantic Ocean. The Allied destruction of so many submarines in the spring of 1943 left the U-boat arm irreparably damaged. The German Navy had suffered one of the most dramatic turnarounds ever in a battle of attrition, with victory almost in sight. 1,000 of its very best officers and men had been killed in a single month. The Allied closure of the air gap, the brilliant use of intelligence, and the deadly submarine-killing escort groups had made certain that the U-boats could never again hope to change the course of the war. Even so, Admiral Dönitz did not give up. New and ever more deadly submarines took to the seas to destroy Allied merchant shipping. The struggle would continue to the very last day of the war, but each and every German development was matched and defeated by the Allies. The long and terrible Battle of Supplies cost the German Navy 27,000 submariners and the Allies 30,000 sailors. In the end, the Kriegsmarine was not only unable to knock Great Britain out of the war, but failed to halt the vast build-up of American forces in the British Isles. By June 1944, the Allies were strong enough to launch the invasion of Europe that within a year would see the final defeat of Nazi Germany.